about 40 to 45 minutes.
Sure.
You talk,
Okay.
and we'll get into Q&A sessions. Okay.
Sure. Okay.
Right.
And I can share
get started.
screen, right? Okay. Yeah. Sure.
Did you send any PowerPoint and anything? Are you going to use PowerPoint?
Yes.
연구소이고요. 오늘 저는 연구소에 참여하고 있는 권헌익입니다. 오늘 싱가포르 역사과의 마즈다 하시모 교수님 모시고 북토크를 하는 기회입니다. 아주 훌륭한 연구하시는 분이라서 기대가 많이 되고요. 여러분도 그 줌 챗방을 통해서 좋은 질문 많이 해주시길 바랍니다. 너무 긴 질문 말고 좀 펀치한 걸로 좀 부탁드립니다. 많이 들어오셨는데. 그러면 바로 시작하겠습니다. Hello everyone. It's good to see many familiar and new faces. This is Seoul National University Asia Center. And today's occasion is a book talk by a prominent historian of modern Japan and East Asia and early Cold War and American foreign policy and international history and Korean War above all. So our honored speaker today is Professor Mazuda Hajimu, Associate Professor of History in Singapore University, and he's very well known for his first book titled War Crucible, the Korea conflict and the post-war world. And the war, the second war is, I hope I'm right to understand it as a post-1945 context. Hajimu is a prolific writer and researcher, and he's working on 2 more books. But today, we're really pleased to have an occasion to hear his 2015 major work, which is highly regarded across scholarly communities, both in history and beyond. And Hajimu, Professor Mazuda is educated in Japan and the US, finishing his PhD in 2012. Am I right? 2012.
Right.
Did you work with the Frederick Roosevelt?
That's right. Longbow and Chen Jian. Yes.
Oh, Chen Jian. Right.
Yes.
It's, Cornell University has some of the most eminent historians of American foreign policy in the context of early and mid-Cold War, and Frederick Roosevelt, who received Pulitzer Prize for his work on First Indochina War. And I assume that many of you are familiar with Professor Chen Jian's book on China's road to the Korean War. And the book is one of the first really truly innovative attempts to integrate social history with international history. And it's widely regarded to be a pioneer in what you guys historians rave about, multi-site, multi-archive research. So Hajimu worked in Korean, Japan, China, way beyond in European archive as well as US archives. So it's my true pleasure to see you. It would have been great had you been able to come over here in person and meet many people who are engaged in similar researches. Definitely next time. Okay, let's get going then. So the organization of today's talk is 40 to 45 minutes. Hajime will briefly introduce his book, okay. And then all of us will jump in and to discuss the book as well as his presentation today. Over to you, Hajime. Good to see you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. 안녕하세요. 처음 뵙겠습니다. 싱가포르 국그림 대학의 마스다 하지무라고 합니다. What to say? 만나서 반갑습니다. Well, I wish I could give my talk in Korean, but from here, let me use English because I forgot almost everything about Korean, which I learned before. So first of all, thank you very much for Professor Honik Kwon for inviting me and for introducing me. And thank you all, quite a lot of people. Thank you all for joining my talk today. So the assignment I was given, so let me share the screen, this one. Okay. So the assignment I was given today was to talk about my first book, the War Crucible, this one, Korean conflict and post-war world. But I want to also talk about my current project, reconceptualizing the Cold War on the ground experiences in Asia as a very end of my talk. So basically, the subject today is the reconsideration of the Cold War history and rethinking of the post-World War II history. So usually when we discuss this kind of topic, these kind of topics, many historians, so as I wrote here, many historians, particularly political historians and diplomatic historians, have tended to focus on policymakers' considerations and behaviors, while at the same time, social and cultural historians have tended to focus on the impact of the Cold War on society, culture, and daily lives of ordinary people. And furthermore, the large majority of the Cold War studies have centered on the US and Europe until very recently. Thus, what Asia specialists have tended to do was to look at the elements of the Cold War in Asia, usually exploring how Cold War, like kind of weather, like Cold War impacted on Asia. So what's missing, I think, what's missing was an attempt to explore how ordinary people and the social background might have conditioned the ways in which Cold War was made, Cold War world was made, and how Asia might have participated in the making of it simultaneously. So that's why in my book called War Crucible, this one, I wanted to synthesize social and diplomatic histories, incorporating ordinary people's voices into the analysis of the Cold War world. So, and I wanted to do this with a global and comparative perspectives by integrating East Asian, Southeast Asian, and American histories. So in doing so, what I really wanted to do was to write a history of ordinary people, the ordinary people's history of the Cold War, with ordinary people, not just as a victim, not just as a hero, but as those who involved in quite brutal and sometimes very scary activities as well. So that's why I tried to use a variety of sources as appeared here. So I don't discuss too much detail here, but these are 5 categories of sources I used in my first book. So usually diplomatic historians pay significant attention to the item number 5, right? Policymakers, memorandum, correspondence, reports, and so on, right? But by using these various kind of sources, what I wanted to do was to bring in the voices of ordinary people, and I wanted to do this to think about how those ordinary people participated in the making of the Cold War world. And this kind of such a use of new material, new sources is important, I think, because it forces us to rethink who the main actors was. And then if we rethink who the main actors was, we need to reconsider what the Cold War really was, what it really was as well, right? So that's the very question I'd like to explore. In this book. So to begin from my conclusion, my book argues that the Cold War was more than international confrontation between Western and Eastern blocs. Rather, my book attempts to reconsider the Cold War in 3 ways. That is, as imagined reality, social mechanism, and ordinary people's war. So here in this talk, let me explain why I came to think this way one by one. So first, let me talk about this, the Cold War as an imagined reality. That said, actually, I didn't have such an idea, such a concept when I began my research at the Truman Library when I was a graduate student at Cornell. Originally, I was simply interested in diplomatic history concerning the Korean War because, my advisor was Fred Rogbal and Chen Zheng, right? And at the time, I was researching how the war was perceived in the US and in many parts of the world. And that was quite interesting because many people viewed it in many different ways. For instance, in the US, the news of the war caused almost like a panic. So in just 4 days after the beginning of the war, the White House received more than 1,000 telegrams and letters. And such continued for next several months every day. For instance, one Oklahoma man sent a letter like this. So, dear Mr. Truman, I don't know much about the war, but I want to know what you think of this. Why don't you load up a few B-29s with atomic bombs, fly over to Russia and let them drop? It's an awful thing to do, but if we don't do it first, Russia will. So I read these kind of letters, hundreds of these kind of letters at the Truman libraries, and noticed one interesting thing. That is, the majority of them, I think all of them, never mention Korea, even though it was the war in Korea. So instead, most of them focused on the Kremlin and Stalin. So this implies that many Americans assumed that the Korean War began with the invasion of Soviet forces on that particular day, that North Koreans must be merely tools of Moscow, and that North Korea's attack must be made by Joseph Stalin. So not surprisingly, most media in America looked at the situation in the similar way, this way. So the Chicago Daily News Report, for instance, reported July 1st in 1950, like this. She said like this: I have a feeling that I have just witnessed the beginning of World War III. So this kind of view was nothing special. As a matter of fact, nearly two-thirds of correspondents to a Gallup poll answered that they believed that the United States was already in World War III and that Russia would drop atomic bomb on American cities. So that's why in this Korean War period, the fear of World War III with the enemy's possible atomic attack spread in the US. In fact, several popular magazines like this one, like Korea's, published future articles on the possible nuclear attacks on American cities, particularly New York City. So that's the situation in the US. And now let me quickly introduce how the war was perceived in China. So the outbreak of the Korean War itself wasn't really a big news in China, but the US intervention in Korea and the Taiwan Strait a few days later created far more serious and complex repercussion, causing almost like a panic in many parts in China, across China. So immediately, various kinds of rumors spread. One of them maintained like this. So one of them is like this. So Chiang Kai-shek has already landed 9 divisions in South Korea. Now, both American and Japanese forces have entered the war, and the World War III will be inescapable. Shenyang, it's northern eastern China. Shenyang cannot avert air raid. So because of such a fear of World War III, the commodity prices rose quickly in many cities throughout China, while stock prices in Beijing, Shanghai, and Tianjin rapidly fell. In Tianjin, for instance, the stock prices declined by nearly half, while the price of gold escalated by 133% in the first week following the US intervention into the Korean War. So observing this situation, one communist, the officials in Raha, in northeastern China, the Dongbei, the northeastern China, lamented in a report written on July 22nd, 1950. So he wrote like this: the people's mind appeared to be in a state of sheer terror. Ordinary people do not trust the value of our paper money anymore, rushing to buy gold and silver, leading to a surge in gold prices. The people do not believe our news report of the victory of North Korean forces. There have been fear of a US atomic attack, which caused some to forecast the end of the war, resulting in the parties of heavy drinking and eating in some area. Some say, let's drink today all liquor we have today. Something like this. So as we can see here, the fear of World War III was quite prevalent in many parts of China at the time. And in fact, this was quite common experience, not just the US and China, but in many other parts of the world at the time as well. So for instance, in Western Europe too, of course, the outbreak of the Korean War was feared as a beginning of World War III. So this was because there was a sort of common sense at the time that the North Korea's attack occurred under Stalin's order, and that the Soviet Union chose Korea merely as a test, and that Stalin's actual strategy, Stalin's real strategy, must be a larger and bigger attack in Europe. So in short, many people in Europe, Western Europe, feared that Korean War was merely a feint operation before a larger and more serious attack in Europe, which could lead to World War III. So then, against the backdrop of such a fear of World War III during the Korean War, discussions for the rearmament of West Germany quickly developed during this Korean War period. And the same was very true in Japan as well. As in Europe, the war in Korea boosted discussions of Japan's rearmament. So one renowned scholar, for instance, argued that the attack shouldn't be seen solely as an action by North Korea, that World War III was possible, and that Japan would need to establish a concept of self-defense, the national defense, in a realistic manner. So now I've just quickly talked about major responses in many parts of the world. And the point is that many people in many parts of the world, like, the thousands of millions of people in like Tokyo and Shanghai and Taipei and Paris and London and New York City, the many people viewed the outbreak of the Korean War as the opening shot of a general war between USSR and the United States, which would mean the beginning of a World War III. So that's why it was not so surprising nor so strange when the Nobel Prize philosopher Bertrand Russell spoke like this in June 1950, at the end of June 1950. So he said like this: "We are already in the initial stage of World War III. If World War III became an actuality, it must happen in Europe and Asia more or less simultaneously." And he even added confidently that Russia will go to war and World War III will last for 10 years. Well, so that said, so looking back from today's vantage point, the discourse, such a discourse of World War III during the Korean War was a product of fear rather than a reality of the world. So Stalin was surely, of course, responsible for accepting Kim Il-sung's persistent appeal, but he didn't order Kim Il-sung to attack South Korea. So as recent studies have shown, the primary factors behind North Korea's invasion was not so much Stalin, Moscow, but more so Kim Il-sung, who had been advocating the concept of Nanjing, the southward march for a few years. So to be sure, Stalin sometimes made very aggressive slogans, but in his actual behaviors and policy making, he remained very cautious about not to start a war with Western forces, particularly with the US in either Europe or Asia. So nevertheless, at the time, and since then, many people considered that Kim Il-sung and Mao Zedong must be mere pawns, like puppets of Stalin, and that the world is heading toward World War III. But the question here is this: why so many people viewed the situation in that way? Well, before the thinking about this question, I want to talk about one more thing. That is this: although discourse of World War III surely spread in many parts of the world simultaneously, it never became a universal idea at that time. For instance, take a look at Canada. So this is a political cartoon published in Toronto Star, which was the largest circulation newspaper in Canada. So in this cartoon, a man behind asked in a kind of a panic, what are we doing? What are we going to do? And then in response, a man tagged Canada, so the in the front, calmly says, "No hysterics, please." So the same newspaper, a few days later, proudly wrote an editorial saying that in Canada, the panic buying which occurred in the US didn't occur. And now, take a look at India. So the Times of India, which was the largest English language newspaper in the country, wrote an editorial immediately after North Korea's attack. So it wrote like this: it urged the war should be treated as a civil war, internal affair for the Korean people to settle. Another letter, one reader's letter published in this newspaper urged that the nation of Asia should frankly tell the great power to leave them alone and allow them to choose political setup according to their own preferences. So apparently in India, many viewed the Korean War from their historical background, from their anti-colonial and anti-Western perspectives. So now, quickly, let's look at the Middle East as well. So reaction in Egypt and neighboring countries was much more critical and disapproving, very, very critical. So the Egyptian, the prime minister, for instance, criticized the US and UN intervention into the Korean War. So like this. Right. So apparently, in these cases of India and Egypt and Indonesia later agreed with them later. So these countries were looking at the situation of Korea from their own historical experiences, that is, their colonial past, rather than feeling the fear of World War III. So what I want to say here is that very roughly speaking, there were two kinds of reactions towards the outbreak of the Korean War. So there was areas in which the fear of World War III mushroomed explosively, while at the same time there were the area where such fear didn't spread at the time so much. So this distinction is quite important, I think, because such differences overlapped with the difference between the region in which Cold War discourses gained verisimilitudes and those in which it didn't take roots. The Cold War logic didn't take roots, at least at this point. So interestingly, these two regions also had another crucial difference. That is the experience about experiences and the memories of World War II. So, this is an important point, I think. So let me explain a little more on this point. So at the time of the Korean War, the region that observed fear of World War III are, so as I just mentioned, Europe, the United States, Soviet Union, of course, and East Asia. And obviously, these are the locations that firmly embraced Cold War logic at the time, right? At the same time, these were regions where World War II had a World War II had left deep and direct scars. So on the other hand, other regions such as Canada, India, Middle East, Africa, and Latin America didn't see the spread of fear of World War III during this Korean War period. And these are regions where the Cold War logic didn't take roots, at least at this time. And interestingly, these are regions which were not the principal battlefields of World War II. So therefore, taken together, maybe I think we can say like this. It was the crucial experiences of World War II that drove many people to view the Korean War as the start of World War III. And this in turn endorsed the actuality of the Cold War world. So viewed in this way, the reality of the Cold War was actually local imagination about the world, however widely shared worldwide. So that's why I'm calling the Cold War as the imagined reality. But when I call it imagined reality, I'm not saying that it was illusion or non-existent. So what I'm saying is that since it was imagined and shared widely, it indeed became irrefutable reality of the world. So in a sense, what I'm saying is a process of how reality was imagined and how such imagination became the reality of the world. So that's my first point. But there still remains another question. That is the why did such imagined reality of the Cold War take roots in many parts of the world at this time of the Korean War? So I want to discuss this question from the social point of view. So here, what I mean by saying the social point of view is that when I think about something, when I'm looking at something, I look at what was happening there, what was going on there, rather than merely examining who started it or policymakers' intentions. So what's going on at that time? So what's interesting about the world during this Korean War period is that this Korean War period observed the simultaneous occurrence of domestic purges, which I would call social purge in various parts of the world. Such include, for instance, McCarthyism in the US, the Red Purge in Japan, the White Terror in Taiwan, the suppression of counter-revolutionaries in China, and un-Filipino activities in the Philippines, as well as anti-labor agitation, strong anti-labor feelings in the UK, and so on and so on. Well, so some of you may be surprised when I call these events as social purge. That is part of social phenomena. This is because all of these phenomena, have been commonly observed through Cold War lens and have been portrayed as local consequences of the global Cold War. But here, I'd like to intentionally remove the Cold War lens and try to look at what's going on there, what was happening there. So the question I would like to explore, I would like to ask is like this. So what was actually being fought over in the name of the Korean War, in the name of the Cold War? What kind of social, cultural, gender, local, or generational conflicts existed underneath the Cold War confrontation? What is the commonalities among these various events that might appear irrelevant to one another, at least at a glance? So those are questions I want to ask. And first, let me very quickly talk about McCarthyism. Well, we think about when we think about McCarthyism, we usually consider it as the rise of anti-communist politics in Cold War America, and we usually think this man on the top, Joseph McCarthy, right? However, in the studies of McCarthyism in the past 2 decades or so, there has been a kind of consensus to criticize the name of McCarthyism itself, saying that what was generally called McCarthyism is a much larger phenomenon involving many kinds of people. That said, there hasn't been any change in terms of the core understanding of a phenomena, that it was the expression of an anti-communist phenomena, and that it was American phenomena. However, by labeling this phenomena as anti-communist politics, I think we tend to dismiss other diverse social suppressions, which involved various kinds of social conflicts, such as racial, labor, and gender conflicts, and tensions in post-war America. And in fact, through my studies, through my research, I came to realize that many victims in this period were not really communist or communist sympathizers, but for instance, the African Americans, civil rights activists, the labor movements activists, working women, feminist activists, homosexuals, as well as advocates of various New Deal programs such as the public housing and universal health care. So what these group of people represented was not really communist ideology, but elements of newly emerging social conflict, which developed through the experiences of the Great Depression and World War II. So therefore, taking this social point of view, I think we can pose the following hypothesis like this. That is, the true nature of McCarthyism, which is often considered the Cold War at home, was not really that of anti-communist politics, but waves of grassroots social backlash against the social change itself under the name of anti-communism, which functioned to pacify the social upheavals and to restore social and cultural order in post-war America. Indeed, this rhetoric of anti-communism functioned very well, very efficiently in containing these elements of social changes. And the reality of the Cold War was not just useful, but necessary to continue silence such social disagreements at home. So in this way, I came to view McCarthyism in terms of anti-communism, not in terms of anti-communist red hunting, but rather as a social suppression that functioned in purifying and making order in post-war America. And when I noticed this point, I realized that it was not only a matter of American history. So as a matter of fact, this was a historical moment when a wave of domestic purges swept across the world, as I mentioned earlier. So let me very quickly discuss China as well. So I don't discuss Taiwan or Philippines, but let me discuss China. Okay, so in this, the China observed suppression of counter-revolutionaries movement, in which more than 700,000 people were executed and more than 1 million people imprisoned during this Korean War period. So conventionally, the movement has been described as a Chinese Communist Party's top-down, coercive political cleansing campaign aimed at eliminating forces of ex-Nationalist Party members and its sympathizers. Therefore, the emphasis in the existing literature was placed on how Beijing, how Mao Zedong used this movement to achieve its political goals at home. However, I think this needs to be further examined because, first of all, the CCP was not always only actor, and second, ordinary people were not simply victims, but often, sometimes, attackers. And third, the nature of the phenomena can be understood not just as a political cleansing campaign from top down, but more like a social cleansing campaign, sometimes among people themselves. So let me share just a few examples to explain why I came to think so. So for instance, the Association of Street Vendors in Beijing implemented this campaign of counter-revolutionary, suppression of counter-revolutionary in its market in the spring of 1951. So in doing so, however, they actually used this campaign for their own purposes of tightening morals and creating orders among their members. As you can see here, the slogans for their version of the campaign included like these, right? And clearly, as you can see here, clearly these issues had nothing to do with the CCP's struggles against counter-revolutionaries, right? And yet, interestingly and importantly, these street vendors campaigns were framed, conducted, and efficiently carried out as if they were related to CCP's struggles. It was claimed that the street vendors were fighting a different kind of war on home front, that cooperation among vendors, street vendors, could stabilize the Chinese economy and maintain public order, and that their tax payment would support the fight against American imperialism on the front line in Korea. So in a similar manner, local in Dong'an market in Beijing, the market in Beijing also participated in the movement in their own ways by adopting guild by association system, in which 5 households formed one group monitoring one another. And in the case of someone violating any promises, all members of this group would be punished. And this kind of mutual surveillance system functioned so efficiently that many people were executed or committed suicide at that time. And here, it's still interesting to look at who were targeted, as in the case for McCarthyism. So this is because it was not only landlords or former Kuomintang GMD members and their supporters who are targeted at this time. There were various other kind of victims, such as those who are regarded as wartime collaborators with Japan, as well as members of secret societies, religious groups, religious societies, and local gangs that has come to hold power in their regions in the 1930s and 40s. So apparently, these group of people, what these group of people shared was not a single ideology such as the counter-revolutionary. Arguably, it can be hypothesized that they represented elements embodying the drastic social change and social chaos that arose during the war against Japan and the Chinese Civil War in the 30s and 1940s. So viewed in this way, what we can see is a social aspect of the movement, which was not particularly unique to the communist revolution period. So that's why I thought it better to reconsider what kind of social conflict, social divisions existed at the local and the social level, and sometimes among people, rather than simply viewing it as a top-down political movement. So here, I don't have much time to discuss other cases such as Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines, or the UK. So please read my book if you're interested in. But here, let me quickly wrap up my findings. So, of course, so these phenomena has its own histories and background, but when examined all together, I think they reveal certain commonalities as well. So first, okay, so this one. First, all of these suppression escalated simultaneously against the backdrop of Korean War that sparked the fear of World War III, right? And second, all of these society went through World War II severely. Thus, they also experienced radical social and cultural change, like social war and cultural war in the aftermath of the war. And the third, all of these social purges, suppressions functioned in suppressing and silencing such social and cultural changes that evolved during and following the wartime, and thus creating harmonious, stable, and orderly society in the post-war period. Fourth, all of these social purges were not the outcome, not just the outcome of mobilization from the top, but participated by ordinary people who engaged in the creation and maintenance of social order through a bottom-up manner. So that's why I characterized the Cold War also as a ordinary people's everyday war. So last but not least, in all of these social purges, the Cold War logic functioned quite efficiently to suppress and silence what were actually social, cultural, or gender disagreements under the banner of ideology and national security, such as anti-communism or suppression of counter-revolutionaries. So taken all together, the wave of domestic purges in many parts of the world can be seen as a global phenomenon of nativist backlash, a kind of social conservatism that operated to contain and silence social disagreements in chaotic post-war period. So when we see these events in this way, what becomes clear, I think, is the actuality of local conflict and the imagined and the constructed nature of the global Cold War, as well as social demands for such imagined reality to overcome war at home. So in this sense, the Cold War divides that emerged during the Korean War existed less between East and Western camps than it did within each society and each communities. And each society required the continuation of Cold War world to maintain the harmonious, stable order at home. So perhaps the Cold War was more than a rivalry among the superpowers at the international level. Conceivably, it could be better understood, I think, as an imagined reality that took a role of social tranquilizer, pacifying various social disagreements in the aftermath of World War II. So, let me quickly finish. Before finishing my talk, let me talk about one implications of my study, the current study. So, first and foremost, this study, I think, could open up new line of inquiries as to the reconsideration of post-war histories in other parts of the world. So what I have tried to do in this book, in a sense, is to relativize the importance of Cold War narrative in post-war history and try to look at locally specific realities, which I called social warfare underneath the mantle of the Cold War world. And in this book, I could discuss only the handful of cases, but a similar pattern might be observable in other parts of the world, particularly in places that have been viewed through Cold War lenses, including, for instance, France and Germany and the Soviet Union, Greece, Turkey, Iran, right? Kenya, Tanzania, South Africa, and also the Guatemala, Mexico, Argentina, as well as Indonesia, Thailand, and of course, and above all, South Korea. So maybe I could call this as a synchronic implication. So the sharing the same time but different places, and along with this line, in the past 3 years, I've also working on the another larger scale project, reconceptualizing the Cold War on the ground experiences in Asia. So this is my ongoing project at NUS, and this is a table of contents for our edited volume, which I hope to publish sometime very soon. And also, through this project, we've created online archives of oral history collections concerning ordinary people's experiences in 20th century Asia, through which we can, we hope to reconsider the history of the Cold Wars and the decolonization in Asia. So we've launched, so we've set up, launched this website, our website, just this month, actually, like 2-3 weeks ago. So please take a look and explore the contents of this website at the rcw-asia.com. So anyway, so let me stop screen. Anyway, so so in this way, so my first book, I think has been opening up new lines of inquiries and research as to the consideration of Cold War Asia and 20th century history in general. So I'm sure I think there's many people came to this talk, and I'm sure many of you are working on different topics or different time periods. But I do hope that you can find something useful from my book, and I hope this book will be read more widely in South Korea as well, because it's very relevant to South Korea's society and history in the post-war period. Okay, thank you very much for listening. Okay, maybe I spoke a little too long.
No, it's perfect. Okay, you could have said a bit more. Thank you so much. Right. So I think comments and queries are pouring in. It's good to see.
We have lots of comments.
Yeah, people are interested. Let me just open up then. It's I had the pleasure to read your book once again. That was a great pleasure, and it's I mean the basic point, the Cold War as such, divides human community as well as it connects many different communities. It's really well taken, and the question of scale, that runs throughout your topography of the Cold War, if you like. And on the one hand, it's a local problem, including the notion of civil war. But on the other hand, imagined or otherwise, a great number of people in the immediate post-war, post-1945 world, so Korean War in the prism of the World War. So the civil or local and the global war or conflict, you take it, you develop it through the different ways in which people in different parts of the world community understood the meaning of the Korean War at the time, when the war was being waged. I think it's good. I think it's a very, very creative approach to the event, which has not been. I mean, maybe some people talked about it. I can't remember, but it's an approach that has never been undertaken systematically. And the second point, and then the way in which the 1950 to 1953 war in the public understanding of this event was filtered through their different yet common experience of 1940 or 1939 to 1945 destruction. Is well taken. And the same point comes to the mechanism bit or discipline, to construction of discipline in a society. And this runs across the border, right? Both in North Korea, right, South Korea, and Taiwan and China. And when there is a white terror, on the other side, there is red terror. And the same happened in the Korean Peninsula. And so this construction of hygienic or clean or tranquilize or opium,
Right.
opium society was being undertaken, being built up across territories at the time. Yeah, there must have been some exceptions, but by and large, right? So your notion of simultaneity or synchronicity, it works really well. And here again, the question of civil and global, or local or global, this what is happening in particular society is related to the particular historical or social or ecological composition of the place. But at the same time, we can't explain what is going on only through the local compositions. If there is a wave, some sort of like a common, some huge wind that people are joining in together. So here again, the purge, the terror of the early Cold War, the social terror, what you call the social warfare of early Cold War or Korean War time, was very much at once local and very generalized phenomenon. It's well taken. So this goes very well with the question of, although with a different texture, with the first question of whether Korean War was a civil war or the beginning of World War III. I mean, now with the Ukrainian context, the outbreak, we talk about World War III once again. But
right.
it's really interesting to know that people were talking about World War III, almost 70 years ago, right?
Right.
And so wonderful. And just to open up, could you, because it's mechanism that that can making a disciplined society, clean, whatever. The way the power that be would like to see the society to be, whether it's a question of race, gender, or hygienic order, or the ethnicity, right? Or sexual orientation.
Right.
Yeah. And then how do you see, I think those of us engaged in early Cold War history through with a focus on Korean War is, nowadays is people must be quite familiar with the fact that, there's the construction of disciplined society, both in the South and North, had huge human toll and extreme consequences on local communities. But the problem in the existing Korean War scholarship within the broader Cold War in Asia or East Asia is that we are not. It's what Japan underwent during the early 1950s. It's really new, and people are not aware of that. I mean, probably it's a reciprocal thing. Public in Japan are not really well aware of the fact that the event that happened in Korean Peninsula had a serious consequences on their own societies. But the same can be said of general public or research communities in South Korea too. So could you say just a few more words on the Red Purge in Japan?
Sure.
How extensive that local global, social cleansing activity was in the first half of 1950s and running through the 1950s. And second one is, as a scholar of diplomatic history, it's really heartening to see that you mention oral history, but don't you have a problem as a diplomatic historian to even mention the word oral history? Because, in disciplinary tradition of your domain,
Right.
it's almost like biblical studies, what is written is sacred, and what is spoken of is something else, completely something else, right? And so two things, and then we'll get into questions from the floor. Thank you so much.
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much for the comment. And yes, the phenomena of the like social cleansing or social purification is very important, very interesting phenomena. And if we look at that social the viewpoint, right, like focusing on like cleansing or purifying or making order in society, I think we can look at the post-war history in a very different way. So if we look at the post-war history or Korean War, from Cold War narrative, Cold War perspective, the South Korea and North Korea seems very antagonistic, and Japan seems on the Western camp, right? And the Japanese people are almost indifferent about what's going on in South Korea, in Korean Peninsula. But when we take a social viewpoint, as you just said, in both northern part and the southern parts of Korea, there was the mechanism of the cleansing, the social cleansing, not just the south, but also northern parts, and the same mechanism was occurring in the Japan in the case as a case of Red Purge. And I just want to say congratulations to your book too. You got a book prize for this book, and this book was I used this book in my graduate seminar this semester, and after reading this, I was so impressed. And because of you also talk about the massacres in both north and south, and making of this the kind of cleansing and looking at the enemy within. And that's very much what I wanted to explore as well. So, and then the question of the Red Purge comes in. So if we look at the Red Purge as a Cold War perspective, it's really the phenomena of, the Cold War at home. But when we look at the situation from a social perspective, it's not really the suppression of bad like communists or communist sympathizers. So I have a chapter on this, the Red Purge. But who are those who are suppressed, who are like kicked out from their company? So Red Purge, of course, the Red Purge is different from the purge in China. So they are not executed or not imprisoned, but about 10,000 people were kicked out from their companies. And traditionally, it was believed that the SCAP, the American occupying forces, controlled Red Purge. But my study suggests that Red Purge should be considered in two different periods. One is Red Purge in newspaper companies, in which almost 700 newspaper men and women were kicked out from their companies. So that's the first wave of Red Purge. So this was conducted by the McCarthy's order. But the second, the wave of Red Purge, in which more than 10,000 people were kicked out from their companies. So the large portion of the Red Purge was conducted by their own initiative, by companies and among their colleagues. There was no order at all from SCAP, the US officials. And when we look at the victims, when we look at those who are kicked out from the company, there were a variety of people, and especially those who are very active in the labor activism, right? And they were considered uncooperative within the company. So I think it's good to reconsider the Red Purge from a social viewpoint instead of simply looking at the Cold War phenomena at home. So then, by looking at the Red Purge from a social perspective, I think we can look at we can consider that Japan South Korea, North Korea, and Taiwan and China and the US are on the same page of history. They are not really the fighting, confronting, not just confronting, but they share similar mechanism at the time. So that's why I think when we look at the Cold War confrontation from a social perspective, I think we can reconsider it as the mechanism of the kind of making wars and making the purity and the harmony within society. And you just mentioned about the situation with Russia and Ukraine, and of course I'm not a specialist at all, but maybe of course we tend to look at the policy makers, the leaders, the intentions, but I think it might be better to think about other way, to think about the social point of view, what's going on in society. And maybe we might be witnessing the another age of, the building walls and the world of purity and the cleansing following the decade of, the decades of like transnationalism, pluralities, and diversity in the late 1990s and early 21st century. So maybe the reconsideration of this early Cold War period gives us some insight to think about the world today, I think. And the second point of oral history, right? Yes. I always have a hard fight with the source, with diplomatic historians, and I'm in the kind of it's better to, combine various kind of materials, including archives, or public opinion polls and oral history. So, I'm not negating the criticizing or negating the importance of archives, but when we write the history of Asia, that there is a difficulty in terms of sources, and this is especially true in Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, and so on, because there is not that kind of the archives existed as in the US or UK. So I think I'm of course accept the importance of archives, but I think I really think the oral history important source to explore past experience. Anyway, yes.
Brilliant. Thank you, Hajimo. I mean, the point that the overemphasis on the supremacy of archival sources, written sources, is undemocratic and ahistorical is very well taken. Right. And
but as you know, diplomatic historians are very critical to using of oral history, and they really feel that the document should be, the archival documents, and they ask me how to prove the truthfulness. They don't call it truthfulness, but how to prove the reliability of oral history. So I always have to fight with this.
It's quite likely that either your colleagues will hate you so much, or some of them may appreciate you. Yeah. Looking forward to hear you.
Yeah, but some are very sympathetic as well.
All right. Yes. There are two really good questions.
Oh, okay.
One is from Dr. Yu Sung-hee. He's a historian of world system. So I think, yes, he's got a couple of questions. The first question is, what concepts do you have as to the post-1950s Korean society relating to the Cold War governing practices? So 1950s were, very much sort of whirlwind. And then post-1950s, and how do, I guess, if I'm not wrong, I think the question means, okay, you try to establish this the mechanism and how to make it sustainable after following the decade in which that saw the art of simultaneity or synchronicity. How do you sustain this mechanism after 1950s? That's a good question. Number two, in a broader perspective, how the global geopolitics or geoeconomics, like global capitalist logics or rules of the internal Cold War system affect each society's Cold War. So
I see.
Can we take it? Can we take it as a question that addresses the global economic system in par with the geopolitical system? Maybe I'm wrong. If we are wrong, Dr. Yu, please jump in. Okay, and then third question another question from Beck Son is oh, this is tough question. Okay, the discipline society in Japan, and what's the how does the Japan's experience of the social construction of social mechanism you addressed is what's the shape of it as of today in 2022, right? Something like that. That's a tough question. Are you still carrying a Japanese passport, Hajimu? Are you a Singaporean citizen?
No, Japanese.
Japanese passport, right? So,
so
you can cleanse your response to this particular question if necessary. But it's a very good question. It's an important question. Okay. The following question, right? And yes. Okay. Then the Hyun-suk, the gentleman appreciates the way you bring local and global together. And the question is, do you think that your viewpoint is still effective in interpreting the war between Ukraine and Russia these days? Wow, yes, right. Oh, yes, I think, yes, all right. Or conflict between two superpowers or self-appointed two superpowers, namely United States and China. Well, yeah, over to you, Hashimo. I have no idea.
Sure. So all are so difficult questions.
Yeah, it's a
Thank you so
question.
much. Thank you so much for these questions. Maybe so can I answer backwards? So maybe Ukraine and Russia these days. So there are two regrets about my book. One is I stopped learning Korean because I had to focus on Chinese and English at that time. But yeah, after reading the Professor Honikon's book, and of course the Professor Kim Dong-chun's book, and also Professor Park Myung-ring, the book. So after reading, I regret I stopped learning Korean. And another regret is the question this three. So another regret is I stopped learning Russian as well. At one point, I tried to include Russian, Soviet Union in my book, but I really gave up because it was so difficult. But again, I think. I wish I could read the Russian or maybe Ukrainian. So I don't read both either Russian or Ukrainian. So it's very difficult to comment. And of course, I'm not a specialist at all. I don't know anything about, I don't know much about the local social history of the Russia or Ukraine. But one thing I would say is that we'd better to look at not just the policymakers, political leaders, the voices, political leaders' intentions, but what's going on among societies, within society and among people. And I'm saying this because of course, this is beyond my capacity, but there might be a possibility of the possibility exists. What I call social warfare or social war or culture war might have existed both the Russian or Ukraine societies in the past 10 years. So 10 years or so, maybe more, but I'm saying with this because the in general war has a function of tightening moral and making of order, making of unity, and making of the togetherness within the walls inside. And when we look at the situation in Russia, this situation, maybe we can say that we are really entering deeply in the era of making wars and make the world of purity and unity and the order. So this kind of order, this kind of the tendency is nothing new. It has been going on in the past decade or so, after following the decades of globalization, transnationalization, plurality, and diversity in the 1990s and early 21st century. So in the past 2 decades, we've seen so much about the rise of social conservatism, grassroots conservatism in many parts of the world, not just the Japan or US, UK, or even in Singapore as well. So maybe we can look at the situation looks so differently at a glance, but if we take a look at the social point of view, maybe what's going on in Russia, Ukraine might be align with what's going on in the world in the past decade or so. So I think of course, I'm not a specialist, so I cannot say definitely, but I guess what I suggested in this book, namely the use of social point of view and the use of the social warfare as a category of analysis, might be useful to examine, to look at the current situation in Russia and Ukraine. And that's connect to maybe the first question about the concept, right? I'm a historian, and before becoming a historian, I was a journalist in newspaper company in Japan, and yeah, as a maybe journalist and maybe as a historian, I usually don't use a concept because maybe by using a concept, I think there are many things that cannot fit into this kind of logic concept. So that's why, what I prefer is to look at what's going on in society and among people, instead of using some kind of concept to analyze society. So I think that's the different the direction of approach. So I think I'm a kind of scholar to look at to look at the situation, what's going on in society, and then from my findings, I try to craft my own concept, that is the social warfare, or the social perspective. So I think that's I don't know if this is my answer, but my answer is I usually don't use particular concept to analyze society. I try to look at society and the people voices. That's why I like oral history. So yeah, so I don't know if this could be answered. The last question about Japan, right? As you study the Cold War, especially, what do you think about today's Japanese social mechanism reality in global manner? Yeah, well, so yeah, well, but I usually try to look at the commonality and the simultaneity rather than try to find the differences in societies. And the reason why I'm trying to do is, generally speaking, I try to write a global and comparative history of social history. Social history from a global and comparative perspective, right? So what I try to do is not really to look at the peculiarity or uniqueness of a particular society, like some Japanese mechanism or Singapore mechanism and so on and so on. But I try to look at some sort of the common shared social mechanism, and not just Japan or a particular society, but shared by many society, like as I just said, Japan or South Korea or the US, China. So yeah, so maybe I didn't answer this question, but that's what I tried to approach to the history.
Thank you, Hajimo. Yeah, is there any other question? Right. Yeah, I think you gave us enough, and I always thought, I mean, this current situation is particularly dire for people like us interested in Cold War come global history. That I always thought that one of the merits of getting interested in something like Cold War is you find traces and remains of Cold War era wherever you go. Southeast Asia, Latin America, Europe, and North America, across Japan and Korea and China. So those of us who like traveling, Cold War is a great subject because you can't avoid Cold War. You find Cold War something wherever you go, right? And then we start connecting.
You can go to Bali or Tahiti.
Bali is a terribly Cold War society, and
Jeju
Islands. I just came back, and then the island of Sakhalin, where I first did my favorite. Mind you, that my Russian is getting rusty too, and I call island of Sakhalin as the first Cold War society, way before the real Cold War, divided between Empire of Japan and Empire of Soviet power since 1925. So we can't avoid Cold War. And so it's painful history, but there is a merit in getting interested in this history because it makes us free. Wherever we go, we feel we are still in Cold War in our mind and our interest. So we find commonality wherever we go. So this is great.
Yeah,
and thank you very much.
I wish we can resume traveling so
Yeah,
that I can
we
go to
should
research.
traveling.
So in the past 2 years, I cannot make travel at all. So.
But nevertheless, it's good to have you.
Improving, yes.
Yeah, and then we'll help you to freshen up your Korean, and we'll definitely bring you to Korea as soon as possible, as soon as things are open.
One last question.
Right.
Yeah. So
thanks for your presentation.
Definition, one word or a point. Wow. So I think if I define one word, maybe the social warfare. Maybe I write it down. Social warfare as a category of analysis. Social warfare as a category of analysis. I think that's one word I want to convey to to you all people. I mean, so if I use social warfare as a category of analysis, I think we can reconsider many things in many, in new ways. So Cold War, we can reconsider it as a, the different way. And I think we can reconsider the current situation in a different way as well. So if I have to, condense my old talk or maybe my entire book to one word, maybe I would say this: social warfare as a category of analysis. And and that's why I think that this book might be applicable, not just what I said is applicable, not just one country, one society, but other society or other period. So that's why I want to have, I want this book read more widely in South Korea as well, and other societies as well.
One last thing then, going back to the question prior to this one about single word definition about the today's Japan. This the Tessa Mori Suzuki, you know her very well, and she said, Korean War is someone else's house on fire from the perspective of Tokyo and Kyoto. And so it's a neighbor's house is in fire, but it's not our house. There's no chance that there's small worry that, but the fire is not going to come to destroy our home. So if we pursue the concept of war in narrow sense, the Korean, this first half of 1950s, Korea was at war, whereas the Japanese society was not at war. So it's difficult to bring this to society, talk to each other. But are you saying, am I right to think that if we bring the concept of social warfare rather than conventional military notion of war, there is a further possibility of creating communication between two societies?
Right. So that's right. So that's what I'm saying. So if we take a look at the situation from Cold War perspective, so the Korea looked at war, Japan not at war, I mean peace, and then the US kind of the long peace, as John Lewis Gaddis said a long time ago. But if we take the social warfare perspective, I would say all societies was actually in the midst of war, social war, not at all long peace at all. So the United States were also in the midst of social war, the active war, and Japan was also in a situation of war, and of course the Korea as well. Of course, the degree of violence, the different so much. In Korea, of course, the huge casualties. But if we take this social warfare perspective, maybe we can go beyond just dividing the wartime society and the peaceful society. That's the kind of the binary. We can go beyond the binary of wartime society and peacetime society. And I'm saying maybe those societies are all going on the internal, the social war at the same time. So I think that's what I'm trying to say.
Thank you, Ajimo. Yeah. So in the end,
by the way,
from the
Hyunjun No, Mr. Hyunjun No is raising a hand.
No, Hyunjung.
Yes, can I intervene?
Hyunjung 씨, yeah. Hyunjung 씨 뭐 할 얘기 있습니까? 네.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Hazumu, and I take your course 4 years ago at Harvard Yensing program.
At Waseda University, right?
And now I have affiliate in
long time not see you. Yeah, nice to see you again.
Yeah, I have a few only one comment, and the how North Korea understand and perceive the Cold War. And North Korea, they rarely use their term Cold War. because they are the main actor who actually bolstered the Cold War, but they used the term Cold War around 1953, and the term appeared in 1956 on their dictionary, and because Cold War inevitably has a very passive notion of global structure, but because of North Korea, they are the one actually who designed and prepared the war. So I think they tend to not using the Cold War. So I think it's quite of irony that who made a war, who made a global Cold War that doesn't use the term the Cold War in their sense. So one of my colleagues are conducting that kind of research, and then that work will be published in English. And I just want to greeting to the Professor Hajime that I can see you again. Thank you, by the way.
Thank you. It's really nice to see you again. Yeah. And yes, thank you so much. And China too, they don't use the term Cold War, Ranjang, so much. They use more anti-imperial war, like anti-American war. Right. So I think similar can be said North Korea as well. So they use more, they don't call it the Cold War, but they use it in terms of anti-colonial war and anti-American war, right? Yeah. Yeah, but I included it because even though they don't use the term Cold War, they were in fact in the player of this Cold War world. So even though they don't use the term Cold War, I use it. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much, Hajime. It's 4:30 here.
Yeah, that's right.
3:30 over there. How is the weather in Singapore? Is it good?
Yeah, now it's raining.
Right, it's raining.
Yeah.
But it's getting warm.
Yeah, it's still hot. I think the April and May is the hottest season in Singapore.
Oh, is that right?
Actually,
And
July and August going down.
Oh, it's a less warm. All right.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, thank you very much. And then I'm sure everybody enjoyed your talk, and we'll see you again.
Thank you so much.
And hopefully in person. Right. Thank you.
Yep, that's right.
Yes.
Maybe in Jeju. Thank you so much.
Right. Bye.
Bye. Okay.